This morning, ongoing coverage in our CBC News and Sports investigation into sexual abuse by coaches in Canadian amateur sport. Offenses committed over the last 2 decades. We looked at those and put together for the first time a database which produced some startling numbers. Let's look at those again. The thousands of court records examined in the investigation show 222 coaches convicted. Their victims, a total of 603 kids and teens, many of whom, most of whom, were the players trained and taught by those coaches. Our investigation shows the convictions, the outstanding charges range as well across 36 different sports. We're going to be looking into those numbers and the stories behind them. And there is our first guest on this morning. Nikki Dryden is with me. Let me introduce Nikki. She is formerly a member of Canada's national swim team, competed at the Olympic level a couple of times, Commonwealth Games, Pan Am Games. Now she's a lawyer in Australia, specializing in immigration, but also in human rights, and that in particularly as far as an athlete's rights activist. It's the perfect backdrop for our conversation this morning. Hello, Nikki Dryden.
Good morning, Heather. Thanks for having me on.
Great to reach you in Sydney. Thank you so much. You just listened as I presented those big numbers, the number of coaches, yes, the number of victims, the sports, 36. I'd like, first of all, your overall response to the scale and scope of the abuse in amateur sport.
Yeah. To me, it's actually where that information is coming from. And I just want to commend the journalists and the team at CBC who worked on that report and did that investigation. And it's kind of sad. It's sad to me that CBC had to be the one that did that report. It's very similar to how the Larry Nassar case in the United States came to be, which was investigative reporting by the Indianapolis Star journalists who were actually investigating abuse, systemic abuse across gymnastics, and they sort of only stumbled upon the Nassar case. And so I think, to me, it's evidence that sport has not been doing enough themselves. The fact that all of these cases have come to light through journalistic investigations, through other criminal investigations regarding child pornography by police investigations. To me, what that tells me is that sport is not doing a very good job, and they should not be left to their own devices to solve this.
Okay. Let me just I want to come back to what sports should be doing when we turn to solutions, but more on the problem and the scope. Someone else, another expert like yourself, said it's just the tip of the iceberg. People still don't get it. Why is this happening? This is my question for you. Why is this happening, and why is the system so broken that there are so many abusers in it?
Yeah, and I think that you're right. It's the tip. This is not the real true story. I mean, most people aren't reporting abuse. There's so many barriers to coming forward, especially when you start getting higher and higher up in elite sport. We have a problem at the grassroots where everything is run by volunteers. It's very difficult for the things to come out in that type of environment. And as you get higher and higher, just the nature of elite sport itself, and there's so many things that go into it, from the athlete who thinks that being tough and being abused equates to being a great athlete, and it just creates an environment where it's easy to be abused, all the way up to just the nature of sport, in the sense that we are spending a lot of time in these very private settings with our coaches. And then there's the power imbalance that happens. And so the fact that you actually have uncovered this many actual reported cases is kind of scary, because what is really happening is all the cases that go unreported or maybe don't quite meet the level of a criminal prosecution, because there are so many levels of abuse. If something is getting to the place where it's being prosecuted criminally and someone is going to jail, that's a very serious crime. But there are a whole host of things that can happen in sport, from neglect to emotional and physical abuse, that may not get to that level of sexual assault, but are equally as bad, and things that we need to be addressing.
So far more prevalent even than this new database suggests. So we've already had quite a range of responses that you might expect from the sport minister, from the COC, the Canadian Paralympic Committee as well, the Canadian Coaches Association. Lots of summits and discussions to come. In your view, what's the fix?
The first thing we have to do is stop thinking of sport as being special and allowing it to take care of this itself. You know, there's actually some research out of the University of Toronto that says that these changes to the law that the sports minister recently announced in 2018, they've always been part of the rules. It's always been a requirement to have safe sport officers. It's always been a requirement to have these sort of policies in place, but nobody ever checked up on them. So first of all, you know, and there's been other research that shows that, you know, most NSOs, national sporting organizations, just don't have any actual way for an athlete to find the resource on their website. So very simple things. So I think we have to stop treating sport special, and it can't be allowed to act on its own. So we have to immediately start thinking about how the government can support it. That's not just through oversight, but that's through dollars. You know, lately there's been a lot of great athlete activism around the anti-doping movement, but what concerns me about that, while anti-doping is obviously very important to elite athletes, it's only impacting a very small amount of people in the sports system. What I would love to see is elite athletes and athlete commissions, whether at the IOC down to the, you know, the Canadian Olympic Committee, those athletes actually talking about sex abuse and other abuse in sport, because that's going to impact a lot more people. And the dollars in research and investment should support that. So all the money we're spending on anti-doping, it should be at least equal to how much money we're putting into ending abuse in sport, because those, to me, that problem is just as important, if not more, than, you know, the anti-doping movement.
Right.
So I think having the government come in with not only policies and laws that are going to be across the country, but also backing it up with money, because we're talking about volunteers. You know, it's very difficult to go to a swim club, you know, in British Columbia and say, all right, you have to now find 3 safe sport officers. They all have to be volunteers. They have to be arm's length from the club. They have to be trained in all of these things, and they're going to be responsible for doing all the reporting and all these things. I mean, that's a huge ask for a volunteer club that, you know, a club that's already run on volunteers. So the government has the ability to invest also in technologies. I mean, there's so many really cool products out there that are helping sports around the world to do this kind of due diligence and risk assessment and helping with reporting. There are apps that the athlete can report abuse right from his or her phone. Right. There's a lot of research that shows that athletes don't want to report abuse, but if it's anonymous, maybe they will. Those same apps then have a interface for the club and then an interface for the federation, so that at every level of that sport, there is an opportunity to interact with technology. And I think there's so many ways we can do this different. You know, Canada set the standard 20 years ago on some of these policies, but they're completely outdated and they're not matching some of the technological advantages that we now have.
Nikki, we need to have you at the table for these summit discussions because you have some really good points to bring into the discussion. And I particularly, I mean, we come back, everyone has mentioned in our coverage the volunteer aspect and the need for monies to get not just to the elite level, but down to provincial organizations and down to the local level as well, because they're, you know, on their own and there's no central sort of authority there. So you raise very important points. Can we conclude, if you wouldn't mind, I've turned to you as an expert, but I want people to know that you're not just an observer of this. As a member of the national swim team in the 1990s, you were there in what you've talked about publicly as a sort of a hypersexualized environment. Can you give us a quick overview of what you experienced and observed and the impact that has had on you today?
Yeah, I mean, imagine coming of, you know, it's already hard enough being a teenager, but coming of age in a swimsuit and then being thrown onto a national team where there are adults, you know, your peers are, if you're a 15-year-old girl, there are men on your team who are in their 20s. And that's like that was a normal environment. And I think things have changed, obviously, since the 90s. There are a little bit more protections in place. But yeah, came into a very, very sexualized environment. Every aspect of the team culture was sexualized. From, you know, rookie initiations to the behavior of the athletes on the deck. And I experienced that not just on the national team, I experienced that at my university in the United States as well. A lot of athlete-on-athlete sexual harassment. So a lot of people think about coach-athlete sexual abuse and abuse, but it also happens athlete-on-athlete, and especially in a sport like swimming where you have huge age differentials. And yeah, you know, when I was 15, one of my teammates tried to rape me, and I was very, very lucky that somebody came into the room and stopped that from happening. And I just, you know, that kind of, you know, I never really told anybody. The people that came into the room didn't say anything. We didn't talk about it ever again. But that person is a predator, and I know he was a predator. But it's took me decades to understand what all that meant. You know, for so long, when you're thinking about the things that have happened to you, you minimize them, and you just think, well, that's sports. That's, you know, that's what you have to do in order to be successful and to be tough and to be accepted as part of a team. But it's totally unacceptable. And, you know, the experiences that I had being sexually harassed at my university in the United States, it was just an environment where it was allowed to happen. And I just found it very interesting that one of my male teammates and university, he went on to become a swim coach who eventually is now on the banned list at USA Swimming. So it's not that there's a direct connection. It is. It's about the acceptance of this kind of behavior, and it has to end. And it has to start. You know, it has to start at the bottom, and it also has to be at the top. And this is prevalent throughout sport. We can't think that this is the end. This is just the beginning of all of this information coming out and people's stories being told.
One of the effects, hopefully, of the CBC News investigation and database.
Yeah.
And Nikki, what a pleasure to have you as our guest this morning. Thank you for telling your stories, both of them, and these types of conversations likely to come to the fore in the wake of this and to get the further national conversation going. Thank you for helping contribute to that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.